This is Vanessa Gorman. Another way of making a sentence more complex is by using participles. We use them in English all the time, and the Greeks use them very often in many ways. And I find that they make life a lot simpler. You may disagree with me, but um, first let's look at how they are formed, the morphology of Greek participles, and then let's look at how we use them. So, what is a participle? A participle is not a conjugated verb. Instead, it is a verbal adjective. And if you keep that definition in mind, it helps you a lot because it has qualities from the verb and it has qualities from the adjective. So, as a verb, it's built from the stem of a verb. You'll look it up under the lemma of a verb. As an adjective, and it can act substantively as a noun, it has number, gender, and case. It modifies a noun, and just like any other adjective, it can be substantized into a noun, and it follows the rules of agreement toward the noun it's modifying. It's got to match it's the word it modifies in gender, number, and case. However, as a verb, it also has tense and voice. As a verb, it may have arguments. It may have a separate subject or object or pronom or ocomp or whatever, and it can have ancillaries or satellites like adverbs. So what is a participle? In English, it's usually these words translated ing or ed, like walking is good exercise. That's the participle used as the subject of the sentence. He will prove to have done nothing wrong is a kind of a pronom. In English, they do something else with it, but in Greek, it would have been a pronom with its own object. Done, nothing wrong. So nothing is the object of done. She hurried along, not stopping to pick up the paper she dropped. This is adverbial. It's just adding a adverbial qualifier to the main sentence. She hurried along, and it has its own object to pick up, which also has its own object, the paper, which has a relative clause in here, which she dropped. You could also have participles that act just completely as adjectives. I drank bottled water. Bottled comes from the verb bottle. And you can also use participles in a way that we call absolute. In Greek, we have something called the genitive absolute. What it means is there's a phrase whose main verb is a participle that is not connected to the rest of the sentence. It stands on its own. Now it's not a complete sentence. It's not an independent clause because there's no conjugated verb in it. But it's a condition that stands by itself. It's essentially a shortcut to make a subordinate clause without bothering to go through and figure out how to make the subordinate clause. You just throw something in the genitive, especially, sometimes the accusative, and we call it a genitive absolute, and it stands by itself. All right, top participles that occur in the Hellenica. And I've ranked them by the lemma, and you see these are all words you know very, very well. If you start looking at this chart, though, you see some interesting characteristics. For example, there aren't that many participles that occur frequently, right? Only 12 occur more than 20 times in the entire first three, or no, in the entire Xenophon's Hellenica. And they are the ones you would expect to see the most. The verb to be, I have, I become, I do, I take, I send, I rule or begin, I make, I wish, I say, I think, I say. The great majority of these are masculine because they're usually modifying some male subject of the sentence or sometimes an object of the sentence, but it's usually modifying men in this work because this work is a narrative that has a lot of wars in it. 3 commonly occur in the feminine or neuter. The verb to be, which you might guess. It still has many more masculines than feminine or neuters because we have many more masculine actors in our books. Gignomai acts the same as Amy a lot of times, so that's not surprising. Praso, notice, doesn't have any feminines, but has a bunch of neuters because if you put it in the neuter, especially in the neuter passive, it becomes things having been done, right? So it becomes the word actions. It becomes substantized. You'll also notice when it comes to tense that the vast majority are either present or aorist. There are very, very few perfects, only 24 in the whole work, only 5 futures in the whole work. So you don't need to worry about learning the forms of the present or the perfect and future very much. The present and aorist are worth learning, like as is usually the case. Some pretty much only occur in the present, like Amy, there is no aorist of Amy. But you notice these don't occur in the aorist to speak of. There are others that are mainly or exclusively aorist. So what I'm trying to say is there's not that many forms, okay? And the ones that are there, you're going to spot very easily because they're verbs that are old friends. Active and deponent, by far, is the most common voice. There simply aren't that many true middles or middle passives. There are some, there's a few like bulomai shows up in the middle passive quite a lot. Again, gignomai shows up because it is a deponent. It's odd that we have any actives here at all, but that must be a different tense. So what this all comes down to, this chart comes down to, is the common forms are the present active and deponent and the aorist active and middle. Those are the common forms. And participles are really easy to spot. They have a verbal root, but they decline as a whole. In the active form, they decline like third declension nouns. So for a normal omega ending present, you just add a nu on the masculine singular and decline it ontos, onti, onta, ontes, onton, usi, ontas, the same endings you see in the third declension. Likewise, the neuter, agon, with a short o in the singular nominative and accusative, agonta in the plural nominative and accusative. And the feminine adds usa and is declined like a first declension. So these are really easy to spot. These are really easy to recognize the form. You see the ag, you know the word ago. They tend to be coming from the most common words. In any case, Alphaeus will tell you it's a participle, and you can go from there. The contract verbs, as you might guess, lengthen the vowels. So instead of agon, agontos, you get timon, timontos. Second aorist, again, you just work off the aorist stem and you use the same endings, so that's fine. Weak aorists are a little bit different because they have the sigma in them. They start with the third principal part. Again, we don't put augments on participles, but again, we make them third declension. So the example here, the aorist of thuo, I sacrifice, sas, santos, santi, santa. So again, it looks like a third declension noun. It's got a sigma, so it tells you it's the aorist. And you know the root. So essentially for the active participles, you have these third declension endings, or in the case of the feminine, first declension endings on a verbal stem. And so they're very easy to spot and they're very easy to interpret. In the present of me verbs, they're all was exceptional, so you have to just get used to them. Again, you have the same declension, but the question is what's the nominative going to be? And that's often a problem. Amy, you get on, ontos, me meaning to go, eon, eontos, didomi, didus, didontos. Once you get in the genitive and the oblique cases, you're fine. The nominative is the only thing that you've got to get used to seeing. The deponents, middles, and middle passives are even easier, way easier, because they simply add the suffix menos, mene, menon as a normal first and second declension endings. So you add to the stem. depending on what the stem is. You don't need to worry about it. And use the first and second declension endings. So praso becomes prasomenos in the present, becomes praxomenos in the aorist. Ago becomes agomenos in the present, and agagomenos, because it comes from the third principal part, in the strong aorist. You see that menos ending, histamenos, stasemenos. So you derive the present from the first principal part, the aorist from the third principal part, and you add this menos with no augment. The aorist passive I'll mention because the sign of the aorist passive, as you'll remember, is the theta, and it's made from the last principal part, the sixth principal part. Luo becomes eluthane. Again, there's no augment, and so you just add the third declension endings and the first declension endings. But the theta is there, and you see that theta, and you say, it's an aorist passive, right? That's what you need, and then you can figure out the rest very easily. Perfect participles are very rare. They're made from the fourth and fifth principal parts. The fourth principal part is the perfect active. The fifth principal part is the perfect middle. Remember, the future will look like the present, but just has the sigma in it. The perfect will have the reduplication and the kappa, which are the sign of the perfect. And again, you'll have the same endings. Menos in the middle passive, as you might expect from my, right? So you're not going to see these much. Arethusa will help you. Don't sweat it. But it's very simple to spot participles. They occur quite a lot, and they're used quite a lot. So participles are easy to spot. How do you use them? And that's what we need to go through next. Now, like adjectives, they can be attributive or substantive, used as a noun phrase, often with an article, not always with an article, such as in English, walking is good exercise. So, for example, here, the ones being with him. We've seen the ones with him plenty of times, but it's actually a shortcut for the ones being with him, and sometimes they write it out. And so the participle ontes is in the nominative plural masculine. It's got the article hoi modifying it, and what's between the article and the participle modifies the participle. With him, being with him is the predicate nominative of being. So the ones with him fled. We have the articular participle governing the pronoun. Here's another one. So Pharnabazus and the messengers of Phrygia, so here's your subjects, heard. Now you tend to hear things in the participles. You tend to hear things either in the genitive or you hear participles. So he heard, again, this is prato in the passive, the things having been done. You see the men, you know it's passive. You see pe, so you know it's reduplicated, so it's perfect. So here's a perfect passive, the things having been done. What do you do with the peri? The things having been done around Byzantium. There's some question about whether it's modifying the verbal part of the participle or the adjectival part of the participle. So it could actually be either adverb or attribute. So you see what I'm saying? The participle acts as both. You also get supplementary participles. A lot of verbs need a participle to complete their meaning. So they are necessary arguments. This is similar to being a complementary infinitive, but a lot of verbs ask for a participle. So he will prove to be doing nothing wrong. A lot of verbs will take a participle in the nominative, referring back to the subject, to be in a state of something, and we typically label them as pronoms. Common verbs taking a supplementary participle are verbs of sensory perception. You hear someone doing something in the participle, you learn them in the participle, you understand them in the participle, you see them in the participle. Verbs of being, these are the ones that take pronoms, matching the subject. I stopped running downhill, right? The running downhill would be a participle in the nominative modifying me. Echo is the most common of these, really. Tuncano is also very common. Tuncano means to happen to be. So to happen being something, right? So you can have the verb have in the sense of am or have been. And these are all in the pronom. So these verbs of sensory perception and knowing and showing will take the participle as an object, and the subject of the participle will be a subject, but it will be in the accusative matching the participle. So, for example, Alcibiades did not happen to be present for the oaths, but rather was near Salembria. So he did not happen being present. We see this construction a lot. He happened to be present. So therefore, the paron is the nominative singular masculine. You label it as a pronom. Present for the oaths. So that's an adverb on the verb to be present. And this whole thing is the pronom of etuchano. This is one of these verbs of being in the state of, and so it matches the subject in gender, number, and case. There's also a circumstantial participle, which gives optional information. This is very, very common as well. So some participles are attributive, kind of like a relative clause in a way. Some participles are circumstantial. They just give extra information. Express circumstance, cause, condition, motivation, either modifying an element of the clause, in which case they're usually attributes, or standing absolutely disconnected from the syntax. So I drank bottled water is an attribute. That's no problem. But the men, being afraid, fled the battlefield. This is a shorthand way of saying because they were afraid. See, we do it in English just like in Greek. Instead of making a causal clause out of it, they simply throw it into a participle that modifies men, and then you can have your own subordinate clause. Now, if you've got a participle thrown in here like this, you can translate it almost any way you want. Because when they were afraid, it could be because they were afraid, right? It could be after they were afraid. There's all kinds of ways to translate it. It's kind of a down and dirty way of making a subordinate clause that's a little bit unclear. All things being equal, I would prefer to go home now. All things being equal is an absolute construction. There's nothing, the all things has no antecedent in the rest of the sentence, right? What's going on in this clause is completely disconnected from the syntax of the main sentence. So this is what we call an absolute construction that would hang as an adverb. And in this case, it requires a subject and a pronom. So all things is the subject and equal is the pronom. So here's an example. A few days later, after these things, metatauta, Thumacares came from Athens. There's your main sentence. Having a few ships. Having a few ships. Having is just a circumstance. It's not necessary to the sentence. So, and it's not attributive, so you don't need to put it as an attribute on Thumacares, even though it's modifying him. Its antecedent is him. It's simply giving us an attendant circumstance. So you match Thumacares in gender, number, and case, but you hang it as an adverb on the main verb. He had having a few ships. Now says it's object, and the subject is implied. So it's giving additional information and is circumstantial. It you translate it however you seem to make sense in the context. So when he had a few ships, he came. After he had a few ships, attendant circumstance, having a few ships, all of these things can make sense. Okay, here's another sentence. This has one of the genitive absolutes in it that I told you are very, very common. So immediately, euthus, again. The Lacedaemonians and the Athenians fought a sea battle, and the Lacedaemonians won. This is the very first sentence of Xenophon's Hellenica. And that all makes sense. It's very simple. But then you have this phrase here. We have the word hegeomai in the genitive deponent, present deponent, and then this man's name, um, Agasandridos, in the genitive. And that's what we call a genitive absolute. We get a subject in the genitive and a participle in the genitive, and it's just an attendant circumstance, essentially. With Agasandridos as leader, when he was leader, under the leadership of, it's just giving us some additional information in a shortcut fashion by throwing it into the genitive. And so you hang the verb, the participle on the verb as an adverb, you hang the subject, the noun as a subject on the participle. In another sentence, after these things by a little, Darius, son of Diagoras, sailed out to the Hellespont from Rhodes. That's all the main sentence. Together with they, with 14 ships. Then we have another genitive absolute here. Chaimonos archomenu, when winter was beginning. This is your genitive absolute. We see this very often temporally. Winter having begun, right? So when winter began, you'd probably translate this temporally. Okay, here's another participle. Here, the main sentence is very simple. The Peloponnesians fled to land, right? The Peloponnesians fled to the land. But then we have this participle in idontes. Idontes is a participle from a defective verb, idon, which means to see. It's defective because it doesn't have any present forms. So we translate it present even though it doesn't look like a present. Here, idontes is a circumstantial participle. You see from the ending, ontes, it's a masculine nominative plural. So it's probably modifying the Peloponnesians. They fled, seeing. What are they seeing? Verbs of sensory perception often take a participle as their object. So they're seeing usas, that's from a me to be, only it's sas, the feminine endings. So we've got feminine things, and it's in the accusative plural. What are we seeing? Seeing the triremes of the Athenians being more by many. So seeing that the Athenian triremes were many more than they were the day before, and they were near the harbor. So the participle here, usas, requires a subject and its own pronoms, right? The triremes are, but it's in the accusative because it's the object of idontes. Seeing that the triremes were more and near the harbor. So the whole sentence together, when they saw that the Athenian triremes were many more than before and they were near the harbor, the Peloponnesians fled to land. So you can say after they saw it, or you can just say seeing, translate it literally, because they saw it, right? Participles can be translated causally or temporally or just circumstantially, whatever fits the context best. Another example here. When he heard that help was already in Samos, Callicratides left 50 ships and Eteonikos as the leader. So Callicratidas left 50 ships and Eteonikes, I don't know why I can't pronounce his name, the leader. Then we have akuon, present, participle, active, masculine, singular, nominative. Must modify Callicratides. But it's not defining him, so we don't have to hang it as an attribute. It's not attributive. It doesn't have the article in front of it. So it's an attendant circumstances. Hearing, and again, you hear something in the participle. that help was in Samos already. So again, these are both this is a subject, this is a predicate nominative. You hear that help is in Samos. Note that the archonta could be a participle. This is one of the problems with this verb. The participle has become a noun. So if you are an archon, you are someone ruling. So it's become a noun, and sometimes you have to decide, is this talking about someone who's officially an archon, or is this just someone who happens to be ruling? So that can be labeled different ways depending on what you think is happening. Okay, here's another sentence. They were. All the Lacedaemonians were. So the verb to be can take a nominative participle in this case. But we have two of them, and we have to decide which is the P-nom. There's no conjunction. So one is a P-nom and one is a circumstance. But the word hos gives it away for us. So they were arraigned. The fact that this is the word order is as it is here helps. So they were arraigned. All of them were arraigned in one line. Epimias, right? And then we have hos. Hos plus a participle is a very, very common construction. And it just gives you the sense of on the pretense that, intending that, alleging that. So they were all arrayed in one line on the pretense that, or for the purpose that, or something like that, preparing, right, to break out and sail around, preparing for a breakout and a sail around. On account of them sailing better. They were arrayed on account of them sailing better. They were arrayed in one line, prepared to break out or sail around. So here we have an articular infinitive acting as the object of the preposition. Here we have the participle acting circumstantially with hos labeled as an adverb part of speech and as an aux relation to indicate intention, pretense. Sometimes you get that when someone's trying to fool someone, and so they prepared as if they were going to fight, but in fact they left. You'll see that hos with a participle all the time. Hos can work this way sometimes with adverbs and adjectives as well. Depends on your author. So you'll see this quite a lot. Participles should not scare you. They're really your friend because they're very easy to spot and they can function however you want them to function in a way. You fit them to the context of the sentence. You have to decide if they're attributive or adverbial. They can modify the subjects or they can modify objects. They can take subordination, but their endings are very straightforward. And again, if you just think of them as verbal adjectives, you've got all the pieces that you need to read the sentence.